Hey, good morning, everyone in our Facebook and LinkedIn multivariate coherence neurofeedback groups. Sorry I missed last week, but I wanted to jump on here and do this next training. Today we're going to talk about functional brain networks, just so we're aware of these systems, because our knowledge of neural connections and systems in the brain is important when we're setting up treatment programs. Our Facebook and LinkedIn groups now are up to about 40 members each. And as always, I want to encourage you to invite your friends and colleagues and people that might be interested in this information and just kind of spread the word. Please have discussions, please ask questions, please pose ideas for future information and training. But certainly until then, I'll continue along this vein. Um, so we've so far talked a little bit about the four-channel multivariate coherence neurofeedback training. We've talked about some efficacy. We've talked about different types of connectivity, effective functional structural connectivity. We've talked about graph theory metrics that help us measure different types of connectivity. In the future, we will go over real-life examples of how we do this in individuals. For today, we're going to cover what are called functional brain networks. So these are networks composed of different functions, so ability areas. So there's what's called a default mode network, salience network, network for reading, for social engagement, for all sorts of things. So that's what we'll be talking about. So when we look at functional brain networks, the one that is known the most, and we spoke on this a little bit last week, is what's called a default mode network. And it is composed of the largest connections in the brain, referred to as a rich club hub of the human connectome, as you can see on the left-hand side there. And there are multiple connections going from frontal to parietal regions. And these blue spaces in here form the connections, if we were to draw a box around it, of the default mode network. So it goes from the basically left and middle right frontal gyrus to the parietal lobules in the back of the brain and everything in between. And let me just see if I have a different picture of that. Yeah, we'll get into its function in a second. So as we talked about these networks, it's the importance of functional networks and how they are different in different regions of the brain. So again, on the left-hand side here, you see an image of the default mode network that connects the parietal cortex with the prefrontal cortex regions, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex regions. And that's one network. The salience network is involved in connecting the anterior cingulate gyrus with the anterior insula underneath the frontal and temporal lobes in the limbic system. And that's what's called the salience network because it helps us alert ourselves to things that are important to pay attention to. And we've got the central executive network, which connects some of the parietal cortex with the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is involved in executive functions such as planning, problem solving, organization, behavioral monitoring, task monitoring, corrections, things of that nature. But again, it's important to go back to our talk. And if you didn't see it or need a refresher, you can always go back and view this on different types of connectivity. So on the top, you can see measurements of what are called functional connectivity, whereas on the bottom, using independent component analysis and more higher level mathematical techniques, effective connectivity strategies, and the regions of the brain identified are different. So typically what happens is they're in the same general vicinity, but the effective connectivity networks are much more precise. And that's what we use in our everyday assessments as well for that very reason. So you always want to notice the difference. You should know that the majority of the research on functional brain networks uses functional connectivity measures. So again, think of these as sort of general regions, not the most precise identification of regions. So the most well-known network is the default mode network, again, connecting parietal to prefrontal regions of the brain. And the main role of the default mode network, this is the network most active when we're at rest. So when an EEG or an fMRI is recorded and someone is not doing anything, they're just sitting still and not engaged in an activity, that's when the default mode network comes on. It is considered important for attention in a resting state, important for being able to be calm and relaxed, so it doesn't work very well in anxiety states. And it's also considered important in attention and memory functions as well. The Salience network, as we talked about, connects which is the one in the middle here, the anterior cingulate gyrus with the anterior insula, and it is responsible for activating our attentional and sort of salience or network of importance in our brain. So it helps us focus in on what's important, and when it's not working very well, to focus in on things that are not as important in our external environment and tend to focus on our internal environment. So in a lot of pain syndromes, we find this dysfunctional. In eating disorders, this is dysfunctional. In autism, this is dysfunctional. So it's really important to have an intact salience network to be able to go back and forth between environmental stimuli, what's important to pay attention to, have the flexibility to not ruminate about other things that are maybe important to that person, but leads to the persistence of symptoms by continuing to over focus on it. Excuse me. Our next one is the central executive network, which handles executive functioning. So again, connecting the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to inferior parietal lobules in the parietal cortex. And this is most responsible for our higher level thinking abilities, planning, problem solving, organizing, task monitoring, and correction and solutions, regulating behavior, affect, but a lot of cognitive processes, mental shifting, planning, figuring things out, things of that nature. Here's another view of the salience network, where you can see the anterior insula in yellow here, and the cingulate cortex right above that here. And we've talked about what that's important for. But it definitely connects the limbic system with the beginning portion of the frontal lobes and cortex to put a value on things and prioritize them. Central executive network we've talked about, but again, connecting the attention switching of the parietal cortex, inhibitory control of the anterior cingulate gyrus, and the attentional network of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, in addition to its control over executive functions, including working memory. And we've talked about those other executive functions, such as self-monitoring, inhibition, control, updating information, attention, etc. The prefrontal cortex exercises executive control over multiple brain regions, especially as it relates to attention and behavior. So, dating all the way back to Alexander Lauria, who was a Russian neuropsychologist in the 1800s, he has this amazing diagram It's not one of these, but this amazing diagram of the prefrontal cortex and its connections to virtually every area of the brain, including cortical, subcortical, and even brainstem and cerebellar regions. And as a result, it is considered the primary inhibitory or control center in the brain. The affective network is a network you can see here in the magenta colored connections. And it has been shown as the areas that are least well connected and least active in major depression. So you can see largely they occur from the frontal to temporal and limbic regions, even posterior temporal locations, and more on the left side than the right, although there are some connections to the right side. So that's very important for people with emotional control challenges, especially depression or negative mood states like depression or anger. Our social network is very important and involves connections of the parietal superior temporal sulcus, the fusiform gyrus, the amygdala, and the orbital frontal cortex in a looping system that provides input back and forth with the orbital frontal cortex being important for controlling our emotional reactions and behavior in these social situations. The other three regions are very critical for social perception and understanding, and that's what our frontal cortex, orbital frontal cortex, then acts on in engaging in social behaviors. Of course, this network, especially the parietal, fusiform gyrus, amygdala, are implicated in the social deficits in autism very significantly. The limbic system isn't really a functional brain system because it does so many things, but it's so important that we wanted to highlight this as being involved in emotion, excuse me, and emotional regulation, memory functioning, even the hypothalamus involved in hormonal and other bodily regulation as well. And of course, the amygdala in red is critical in these functions, as are others related to memory functions in the hippocampus and fornix, and hypothalamic hormonal and body system regulators in terms of heart rate, blood pressure, etc., in response to emotional stimuli. All are contained within our limbic system, or our quote-unquote emotional brain. Okay, so that covers our functional brain networks. Next week, we'll be covering measurements of effective connectivity and show you some case examples of how that happens in real life and how we look at that information and go from there. Again, hope you all have a great weekend and great week and have enjoyed this. And please ask questions, invite colleagues, and let's continue to share the wealth of information. All right, have a great weekend. Bye-bye.